Thank you so much for having me. I just wanted to take a note and acknowledge EGA and Mardi Gras for helping bring me over. I know coming to such remote locales takes a lot of economic energy and work, so thanks y'all for having me. Initially, I had planned on starting this talk with a whole bunch of my own experiences, but in the interest of time, I've scrapped those, and maybe we can get into that in some of the Q&A or panel as relevant. So for me, my psychedelic experiences have always, or at least from their genesis, carried significant political content when I trace it back to literally my first mushroom experiences and sort of what I considered to be a radical synthesis whereby all of these disparate understandings came together, and I was able to see that rather than being individuated, disconnected understandings of systems of power, capitalism, race, etc., that a lot of these systems and institutions actually fed off of each other. Drug-induced politics. So, you know, we live in a world where we can have experiences. If we look at the literature from the last 50 plus years of psychedelic engagement, there emerges a body of concepts that seem to hold true throughout time. Now, this is not to essentialize psychedelic experiences or say that there is a singular psychedelic experience that leads to these outcomes, rather that if we look through the collective reports of numerous individuals over decades, we can see certain patterns and similarities emerge. So, you know, one of these concepts might be the notion that love is all there is, love is the most important thing in the universe, and that ultimately you are a complete functional human being just as you are. Now, when we come back from that trip and we see that there's trillions of dollars in ad spend focused on telling you that you're unlovable and incomplete unless you buy XYZ consumer product. Your friends will not accept you unless you have the right deodorant, the right detergent, unless you smile in the right ways, unless you get the perfect apps. We can see that there's an inherent political tension there. So too, if we look at messages around the significance of ecological integrity and coming back to a world where industrial civilization is literally decimating the planet, to the point so much where a friend messaged me the other day to say, isn't it kind of absurd that we're living through the ecological catastrophes that all of our teachers talked about in the abstract as we were growing up? Additionally, I would suggest we can come across notions about the importance of play and interconnection, both with other humans and our broader environments. And then we come back to a world where we see commodified social and labor relationships, where we relate to each other through the things we buy, through our positions in the workforce, through renting ourselves out in order to afford the basics of food, clothes, and shelter. Similarly, to put it in the sort of cheesy sense, right, these notions that we're all one, that we are all part of each other and part of the same thing, and then we come back to a world that literally thrives off of the atomization by splitting us up, separating us, putting us into boxes where we feel disconnected and alone. It makes us feel powerless, and it actually creates a more precarious workforce where we don't recognize that we have affinity and solidarity with numerous other people in very similar positions, and we find ourselves pitted against people who should be our natural allies. So to me, the notion that there can be this sort of apolitical psychedelia that many researchers seem to extol doesn't hold true, at least based on my own experiences and, you know, looking around the broader space. With that being said, if we rewind to some of the history of criminalization, we can see that there are actually discrete political causes that can help us understand the context we're currently in. So I'm going to stick to a US context because that's what I know best. But looking at reasons why drugs are illegal in the US, we see white supremacy. Harry Anslinger, the first drug czar in the US, stated that the primary reason to outlaw marijuana is its effect on the degenerate races. We see numerous historical cases of police departments claiming they needed larger caliber ammunition to put down cocaine-crazed Negroes who were lusting after white women. We also see clear ties to imperialism, with Nixon advisor John Ehrlichman making a statement where he acknowledged that they recognized that they couldn't criminalize being black or against the war, but they could associate the hippies with marijuana, the blacks with heroin, criminalize both, and then, you know, drag them through news cycles, harass them, incarcerate their leaders, etc. In the case of misogyny, we have this quote from Nixon who said, "Homosexuality, dope, immorality in general are the enemies of strong societies." So we see this sort of moralizing around what is or is not desirable within culture, and then the use of those value systems to essentially marginalize and oppress folks. And similarly, I would contend by and large, we see that psychedelics aren't particularly good for the production of widgets. Now, in recent years, that has changed as narratives around microdosing have become more prevalent. And I would suggest it's not a mistake that we have seen more willingness from folks within a capitalist context to engage with psychedelics at the point where they're no longer presented as boundary-dissolving agents that pose a threat to the established socioeconomic order and can in fact be given to your coders and programmers to develop more efficient and creative apps. So, considering that psychedelics appear to exist in a blatantly political context, I think it's important to examine what I would consider to be the floating signifiers of legitimacy and authority. Basically, who gets to dictate the terms of the terrain on which we're operating. And so I would contend that dominant culture and the state are ultimately predicated on coercion and violence. And what I mean by that is, in the US context, if I break the law, I expect a police officer who is authorized to use lethal force to show up. He or she is backed by the full might of the so-called justice system, which has the power, again, to kill me, incarcerate me, or otherwise mete out so-called justice. Now, that means that even if there's not the explicit use of violence, the implicit threat of violence overhangs all social relationships. Additionally, I would contend that authority, whether state or otherwise, is not self-justifying, meaning if somebody says you can't do something, they need to be able to say why. Noam Chomsky uses the example of a 4-year-old child attempting to run out into the street, the parent grabbing the child and bringing them back onto the sidewalk as an example of justifiable authority. I think if we look more broadly at society, we can see the vast majority of authoritarian exercises are not actually justifiable. And, in the case of psychedelics, they weren't criminalized by accident or based on any empirical or scientific evidence. And so, as a result, I would contend that psychedelics belong in the public domain, that whether we're talking about medical, spiritual, intellectual, recreational, or any other use, they're entirely legitimate. And the burden of proof or the burden of justification is on anybody who's spouting any degree of prohibitionist narrative, asserting that you don't have a fundamental right to access these compounds and experiences. That brings us into the context of mainstreaming. So what I would assert mainstreaming is essentially respectability politics meant to assuage dominant culture. And by that, what I mean is that we're expected to show that our values are continuous with those of dominant culture. And considering that dominant culture includes systems of capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, I would contend that that certainly doesn't reflect my values. I don't know about folks in the audience. But I would contend that, right there we can see some subversion of the potential political impacts of psychedelics. I would also contend that we see the whitewashing and homogenizing of marginalized perspectives, again, inherent when you're trying to make your value systems continuous with those of dominant culture. In order to fit into mainstream paradigms, substances have to be commercialized. Again, everything is commodity relationships through the marketplace. This is the way international political relationships ultimately function within global capitalism. And we also see the flattening and commodification of culture. One very minor example would be perhaps MAPS's use of the term at the end of some of their fundraising emails, support psychedelic science, where in context, support is understood to mean give money, and psychedelic science is understood to mean the very narrow spectrum that MAPS actually engages in. And so we sort of lose the ability to define some of what these terms mean on our own terrain and based on our own experiences. I know plenty of people who have supported quite a bit of psychedelic science without donating a penny to MAPS. We also see, coming out of this mainstreaming narrative, what I would consider to be a contingent of folks who are engaged in rhetoric around a concept I call Prohibition Light. This particular quote from Dr. Dave Nickles underscores it pretty well, where he said, "I would still penalize manufacturers and traffickers of psychedelics, although I think penalties should be rethought. They are probably much too harsh in most states." This is imagining a post-prohibition world. Now, somebody might want to remind Dr. Nickles that he is in fact a manufacturer of psychedelic substances, so it seems like what's going on here is that he's making an appeal to the authority of the state, where even though psychedelics weren't criminalized as the result of any empirical or scientific evidence, he's still willing to cede that agency and autonomy to the state and say that there is something special about the state license that he has. I would suggest that those dynamics reflect negatively on anybody who is not in the privileged position of being able to get such licensure, which likely includes most of us. So if it's not apparent by now, I think the mainstream is a mistake. I think that attempting to show our values are continuous with dominant culture is super problematic, considering that dominant culture literally presents an existential threat to life on this planet, and that, ultimately at the end of the day, if we see collapse, it doesn't really matter how much psychedelics might benefit us in the abstract and whether or not anybody finds our narratives tolerable. Similarly, for many of these assertions that if we strip out the most offensive or upsetting or radical components of psychedelics, and that will somehow bring forth a change in society that seems to hinge on those very elements, I would ask the people asserting those narratives to demonstrate some sort of evidence for them. And I've actually been asking that for several years and have yet to receive a coherent response. That question is still out there for anyone who would like to engage with it. And so I would assert that without evidence, we're ultimately looking at meaningless propaganda, where just as with Abby Hoffman's assertion that we should just put acid into the water and that will somehow magically change society, now we're seeing narratives that if we put psychedelics into the therapist room, somehow that will magically change society. And I would contend that when we look at meaningless propaganda, we actually see a good bit of it bandied about psychedelic spaces. So if we consider a lot of the narratives about why we need to focus on PTSD and veterans and in some cases active duty soldiers, again, this quote from Chomsky I think is rather revealing. The point of public relations slogans like "support our troops" is that they don't mean anything. That's the whole point of good propaganda. You want to create a slogan that nobody's going to be against and everybody's going to be for. Nobody knows what it means because it doesn't mean anything. Its crucial value is that it diverts your attention from a question that does mean something. Do you support our policy? That's the one you're not allowed to talk about. And in the context of ongoing drone warfare perpetuated by the United States, including a significant amount of extrajudicial drone strikes in countries with which there has been no war declared, not that declaring war is desirable, we can see that these narratives about support the troops and provide therapy for veterans who've been through these horrific experiences, ultimately divert from the question of what is up with U.S. foreign policy. And to be clear, I'm not asserting that veterans shouldn't have access to anything that helps them deal with their trauma. Frankly, I think anybody should, whether they're a veteran or not, whether they're a police officer or anybody else. Now, personally, I don't think it makes sense to prioritize veterans and police officers over the populations that they're deployed against, but we can see that this is one of the major tension points between certain advocates of mainstreaming and people like myself. So if we look at this quote from Rick Doblin, this was in a podcast that he did where he administered some sort of MDMA not quite therapy at Burning Man, and they recorded this, and he stated regarding the person he sat with, and the fact that it was both a veteran and a retired police officer, the same person, it just made me think that this is the ideal kind of person we're trying to show. If we're trying to mainstream psychedelics, what's more mainstream than a veteran and a police officer? And in the context of the US, we can trace a direct historical lineage from southern slave-catching gangs to the modern police force. There's no broken lineage. The historical evidence is laid out. There's a fabulous book by Kristen Williams called Our Enemies in Blue that lays out the history and cites pretty much every aspect of it. So what's more mainstream? Again, I would suggest the communities that cops are actually occupying and the people that they're incarcerating and victims of the war on some people who use certain drugs and, all those folks. So I would go on to contend that ultimately social peace is an illusion. And what I mean by that is that the apparent stability of daily life for those of us who are privileged to experience some stability in daily life is actually predicated on violence. Many of us don't actually have to experience much of that violence. Some of us may find it particularly visceral when we do experience that violence, precisely because it's generally not part and parcel of our daily lives. However, I would assert that there are populations for whom that is a daily reality, and that to assume that things are good enough for us, when we use terms like us and we and these collective facades, it really masks the intersectionality at play in society. So when we look at these systems of violence and we see structural components that are feeding into this, if we can't actually engage in systemic critique, if we can't unpack the various components of the world that we're living in, ideally through understandings of intersections of race, class, gender, the historical context, then it becomes impossible to advance coherent socio-political theories, and you wind up with folks like Rick Doblin asserting that, if we could only send enough MDMA to the various religious leaders around the world, we could end sectarian violence, which in fact Doblin attempted, and it doesn't seem to have worked. Surprise, surprise. So ultimately, I would contend that cops, military enlistees, and the, fraction of the top 1% don't actually have the same interests as most of us. Certainly not the same interests as those that they arrest, murder, and exploit. And in the context of the various vocal critiques I've offered over the past years, I get a lot of people who tell me that I'm being divisive or abrasive. And, I would suggest that ultimately at the end of the day, we can't all just get along precisely because of these structural components. And unless we're able to acknowledge them, we're going to keep hitting this wall. Now, another critique that I've commonly heard is that I'm against the medicalization of research, that I don't support sanctioned researchers or scientific pursuits into psychedelics. So lucky for me, I wrote this piece back in 2014 and then presented on a very similar topic at Breaking Convention, where I said, exploring psychedelics as medicines presents beneficial research, but this is hardly the full story. Limiting our research to acute medicinal benefits neglects significant facets of psychedelic experiences, and discrete partnerships between sanctioned and underground researchers make the most sense. So I'd just like to be explicit that I'm not advocating against medical models, I'm not advocating against sanctioned research. Rather, I'm trying to envision a world where we have the most diverse psychedelic terrain possible, and each of these different approaches sort of represent their own trail blazed across that terrain. Now, where it makes sense for them to intersect, absolutely, I think they should. My concern is about the hegemonic dominance of any of these models, particularly when it comes to notions of mainstreaming and medicalization, precisely because of all of the unaddressed issues that, to my mind, those approaches leave. This brings us to the recent discussions about open science. Assuming most people have not been familiar with these discussions, the open science statement with regards to psilocybin, MDMA, and other psychedelics was put together by a number of folks who were really concerned about the potential for corporate actors in this space. And rather than giving the full breakdown, it's literally a one-page document. It's online. You can check it out. Super quick read. But the main tenets are that researchers engaged in psychedelic research should ultimately maintain intellectual and scientific integrity, report accurately the positive findings that they have, the negative findings, what they may not be excited about, which we got a great example of earlier today. Similarly, they should be placing the common good above private gain, that essentially these compounds and their effects represent far too great of a potential boon to humanity to wall off behind paywalls and attempts at maximizing profits. Similarly, they shouldn't be withholding materials or knowledge for commercial advantage, and that at the end of the day, these discoveries should be placed in the public domain for the benefit of all. Now, again, I would contend that the the open science approach is inherently political, that there's no way of getting around the fact that this document was put out in an attempt to moderate and mitigate some of the potential harms that some very long-standing and well-respected researchers saw emerging on the terrain. Robert Jesse has commented that, you know, he wasn't interested in naming names. He saw actors that were on the terrain or approaching the terrain that inspired him to write or contribute to the open science statement. Some of the earliest actors on the terrain were a company called Compass Pathways, another company called Ellucis Public Benefit Corporation. However, since then, I would say the list of corporadelic actors has actually expanded quite steadily. Now, just as far as defining some of these terms, corporadelic has been thrown around by a few people, including Catherine McLean and others of late. I think it's a really useful term because it doesn't just mean, if we take, you know, some of the roots, it shouldn't just be understood to mean corporations that are engaging with psychedelics, but should also refer to actors who are actively manifesting sort of corporate approaches by the way that they're functioning on the terrain. So I would suggest that it's not necessarily limited to corporations, but to people who are pushing agendas that, if we take them to their logical conclusions or if we unpack the assertions therein, we can see the sort of inherent impetus towards what we might consider to be corporate values. This little graphic up here is from manufacturing consent and ultimately goes through the checklists from the DSM-4, indicating that, you know, the way that corporations act is fundamentally psychopathic. And so some recent corporadelic actors, and this is likely not an exhaustive list, include Atai Life Sciences. I have Atai over Compass Pathways, MineStrong Health, Palantir, and Inaplexus because they're all involved with each other. Compass Pathways is a company located in the UK that's looking to set up therapeutic psilocybin approaches. MineStrong is associated with them as well, as is Palantir. Inaplexus is associated with Atai. Pretty much all of the funders and actors of these companies are intimately involved with each other, sit on each other's boards, actually have C-suite roles in some of the various corporations. We also see Ellucis Public Benefit Corporation, which has been doing LSD research. They funded the recent Beckley microdosing study and several, if you look at the notes about conflicts of interest, you'll find a disclaimer about EPBC. Similarly, I believe some of the Ellucis employees were also on the research team that carried out that study. We also have the US military, MAPS and the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, and Michael Pollan. And just to give a heads up, if we have time, we can talk a little bit about Pollan and MAPS. I wasn't sure how long this was going to run. Things have been a little nuts, and so I don't have a full treatment of those, but we can consider it a teaser for future engagement. So I'll kick it off with Atai Life Sciences. Now, this was funded by this German guy named Christian Angermeyer. My recollection is that he was a fairly wealthy film producer who has recently gotten into psychedelic research. He gave an interview in Business Times where he said that he's very excited about the virgin market that their VC funds are prepared to unleash. And as of October 2018, Atai owned about 25% of Compass. Last valuation I'd seen for Compass for Atai was about $25 million. And the team and investors of Atai Life Science include, as I mentioned, a bunch of folks who are also involved at Compass. So we see Mike Novogratz, who was a fairly big player in the crypto space. Lars Wild is a former refrigerator salesman who is on the Compass C-suite as well as on the Atai C-suite. Tew and Smith actually run a meditation app called Calm, where it's, I think one of the big developments or things that have gotten a lot of traction for them are adult bedtime stories. And so, playing with that liminal space in the context of some of the potential for behavior modification that we'll get a little bit into strikes me as potentially worrying, not to be alarmist. And I'm going to do my best to provide evidence for various assertions that I'll make, because I know some of it sounds really conspiratorial. And if we look at the broader portfolio of Atai, we see these companies, Compass, Inaplexis, and Perception Neuroscience. You may have heard of the recent Johnson & Johnson push to patent S-ketamine, which is an isomer of ketamine. Perception Neuroscience, as I understand it, is pursuing R-ketamine, which is the other isomer of ketamine. So, stay tuned. This will likely be playing out in coming months and years. And I would suggest that just as much as people have decried Johnson & Johnson's approach, there will be very similar critiques to level at Perception. When we talk about, so I've made quite a fuss about Compass at various points. To be fair, the only reason I didn't put them in front of Atai is because at this point it seems like Atai and their series of connections is actually more significant than Compass. They were just sort of slower to lift their head up. But some of the issues that have emerged around Compass include the fact that they blocked psychedelic research via an exclusivity deal with a pharmaceutical company called Onyx. So basically, to give a very brief encapsulation, and I've gone into this in much greater detail in other talks, which are up on my channel on YouTube, there is this company, pharmaceutical company called Onyx. MAPS ultimately referred Compass to Onyx to produce a GMP psilocybin. GMP means good manufacturing process, and it's essentially a standard that the FDA requires for pharmaceutical drugs. Now, part of the reason it seems that psychedelic researchers hadn't been required to meet GMP standards initially is that most of this was being done in a pure research context. So as far as FDA was concerned, it wasn't really going to be something at that point in time that was being produced for human consumption, in the mass market, and so they were kind of fine with having some of the, I guess it was research-grade psilocybin that was being produced by folks like Dave Nickles. So Compass got turned on to Onyx. When they began to engage with Onyx, they set an agreement that included an exclusivity clause, basically saying that Onyx would not manufacture psilocybin for anyone else. Now, Compass was in no way ready to start with phase anything trials. There were research institutions in the United States that had teams assembled and ready to go with psilocybin research. Ultimately, because the FDA had changed their requirements around the GMP necessity, those research teams were ultimately put in holding patterns and hemorrhaged huge amounts of money. Now, in the context of psychedelic research, which is generally privately funded because of the criminalized nature of these substances, that's not insignificant when we're talking about small numbers of donors that are giving fairly large amounts of cash in order to keep these efforts going. Additionally, if we look at their behavior, we see repeated disingenuous statements and actions. So, for example, George Goldsmith, one of the founders, made a statement at the ICPR conference in 2016, I believe, that because of the importance of psychedelic research, this is why they set up a nonprofit research institution, Compass Pathways. Now, I think it was like 7 days, maybe 10 days later, they actually filed for paperwork in the UK that set them up as a for-profit company. Now, the notion that he didn't know that that was going to happen when he told this room full of psychedelic enthusiasts and researchers and other folks seems really unlikely. Now, furthermore, when his partner, Katya Malevskaya, wrote what I would consider to be a sponsored content op-ed in the MAPS bulletin, which MAPS invited, she asserted that they hadn't actually done this, that she sort of used this doublespeak to say that it was both a nonprofit and a for-profit, and kind of walks around the fact that they established a for-profit so that they could take advantage of certain benefits that the for-profit could reap that the nonprofit couldn't. However, materially, they had established a for-profit and were able to act as such. There was also a moment where George Goldsmith was in a MAPS board meeting and was asked a question by Natalie Ginsburg about the problems of putting profits before people in pharmaceutical contexts. George Goldsmith erupted into tears and basically said, how can you possibly question me? Do you know what I've done? Well, the thing is, I do know what George Goldsmith has done. His previous company was Tapestry Networks, and they trafficked in regulatory capture. For those not familiar with the term, regulatory capture is basically the integration of state apparatus with private business and regulatory agencies where you buy out the people who are essentially required to keep an eye on you and make sure that you're following the law. So Tapestry Networks was a small boutique firm, is a small boutique firm relatively, and they distinguish themselves from other actors in the space by the way that they set up these relationships with certain industries. So for example, following the financial collapse of 2008, Tapestry Networks stepped in to re-establish trust between the banking industry and regulators. Now, I would suggest in the wake of the 2008 financial crash, there was absolutely no reason for regulators to have any trust of the financial industry. And as we saw in the years immediately following the crash, the production of new financial instruments and sketchy derivatives was already well underway. I would assert that's further evidence that folks who are engaged in those sorts of practices are pretty good at disingenuous approaches and sort of saying what needs to be said to get where they need to go. Similarly, Tapestry Networks has been involved in extractive industry, in partnerships, collaborations with military-industrial complex folks such as Northrop Grumman. The list kind of goes on and on. They have this really horrific white paper, or had this really horrific white paper about fracking and how even though there's no evidence to really support the ecological safety, ultimately we should take a wait-and-see approach. And a number of those white papers were disappeared off of the Tapestry Network site around the same time that Compass put forth their PR Newswire note letting people know that they'd gotten approval for psilocybin phase 2 studies. I archived that entire website and have been meaning to expand on some of the aspects in there. Now, additionally, if we look at some of the founding stories about Compass Pathways, one of the narratives that gets told is that George and Katya were so distraught about their son's experience with depression that they recognized that psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression was incredibly important and significant. But if we actually scroll back, Compass was engaged with Ellucis Public Benefit Corporation to engage with the Isle of Man because they're a regulatory haven. They're pretty flexible when it comes to regulation. For a while, they were a tax haven. I think some of those laws have changed. But the initial plan was to do end-of-life hospice, like psilocybin hospice, plus a sort of resort and luxury spa. Again, for folks interested in psychedelics and in a legal terrain where they could be supported in pursuing that without fear of reprisal. Now, that seems kind of at odds with the narratives that would later emerge around depression. I don't know for certain which is or is not true. I just think it's interesting to sort of see some of those manipulations. I already did the regulatory fixation. For folks that are interested in that, I did quite a bit of a document dump in the other talk that I referenced earlier, and I would suggest checking that out. It goes pretty deep, but something to look at. This quote at the end, this conundrum, do we pursue this as for-profit or not for-profit, consulted and decided the market would support a for-profit. These are direct notes from a MAPS board meeting that George Goldsmith was present at. I'm assuming they're not his direct words, but rather were what was transcribed in the context of the meeting. And again, this shoots major holes in a lot of the narrative that's being offered around Compass and why they're on the terrain and what their actual interests are. If we go over to MineStrong Health, they're a Compass partner, and their tagline is essentially, the app that knows you're depressed before you do. If you don't find that creepy, I don't really know what to tell you. So essentially, the app utilizes machine learning based on your smartphone interactions. So whereas there are already a host of predictive analytic smartphone apps that can do all sorts of crazy things from, there's one app that can actually measure or predict your credit score based in part on the number of times you charge your cell phone in a given day. Once you get into big data analytics and tracking, there's all sorts of things that seem very innocuous or meaningless that when you can plug it into the larger picture, actually develop really insidious and granular, deep understandings and deep dives into some of the data. The context or the tools, the analysis that Shoshana Zuboff puts out around surveillance capitalism is actually really helpful to understanding a lot of what seems to be emerging in the corporadelic space. The amount of data, for example, metadata that you can get from an emoji or from your location data or things like that kind of pale in comparison to when you can actually get real biological markers based on, more significant interactions. And we've seen this with Facebook's manipulation of the news feed. Mark Pesce gave a really phenomenal talk at EGA in 2017 that I highly suggest you check out if you're interested in this stuff. So MineStrong was founded by Tom Insel, who was the former head of the National Institute of Mental Health. He's also a member of Compass's Scientific Advisory Board. And under him, the NIMH discarded the DSM-4, or was looking to discard the DSM in favor of new models. Now, many mental health professionals will tell you that there's all sorts of problem with the DSM, and I'm certainly not asserting it to be otherwise. However, we can see some of the problems in his reductionist approach if we look at this quote where he says, "Mental disorders are biological disorders involving brain circuits that implicate specific domains of cognition, emotion, or behavior." And while that's all well and good, I would suggest that this approach that sort of neglects entirely any sort of social, cultural, or communal factors in mental health and well-being, particularly in the context of global industrial capitalism, when many of us find ourselves in incredibly coercive and destructive relationships just as the basic necessity of what it takes for us to keep ourselves alive, that there are, I think, significant reasons to push back against some of these reductionist approaches. It's also worth noting that MineStrong and Compass, Insel, Goldsmith, and Paul Summergrad, who's also associated with Compass, were all present at MAPS 2017. They hosted a panel called The Future of Psychedelic Psychiatry. Pollen plugged that in the last chapter of his book in a rather questionable way. Maybe we can get to that later. So Palantir, you may be familiar with this company run by Peter Thiel. I would say, perhaps they are the most literal surveillance capitalist firm in the sense that they're literally making profit off of surveillance and not in the sort of social media way. So Peter Thiel has some really choice quotes such as, "You shouldn't try to compete, or you shouldn't compete, try to have a monopoly." It should be worth noting that Doblin asserted that he doesn't think Thiel is interested in monopolies. He stated that the 1920s were the last decade in American history during which one could be genuinely optimistic about politics. It should be noted that that's the age of robber barons, sort of preceding times where socioeconomic tensions were so bad in the US that anarchists literally started bombing Wall Street. The vast increase in welfare beneficiaries and the extension of the franchise to women have rendered the notion of capitalist democracy into an oxymoron. In addition to these sort of reprehensible personal views, there are the actual material components of Palantir, which include recently the awarding of a 3-year, $7 million contract to manage National Institute of Health, big data. I would suggest in the context of surveillance capitalism, the amount of profits and utility of especially personal health data, this is particularly alarming. Not least of which because if we look at the history of Google, Facebook, Palantir, and other surveillance capitalist firms, we can see that generally the stories that they tell us about how data will be protected, utilized, shared, they frequently don't match up to reality until there's some sort of investigative journalism that demonstrates that, in fact, all of the things they've said they aren't doing, they are. So we also see there's an $800 million Pentagon battlefield intelligence contract that was recently won by Palantir to build the battlefield AI of the future. Again, rather terrifying. And most recently, I think, it came out that they've facilitated immigrations and custom enforcement prosecution of migrant parents, utilizing the designation, well, ICE has utilized the designation of these parents as being smugglers of children. Now, Palantir denied for ages that they had any sort of anything to do with this, that the sort of data that they had been paid to provide to ICE well ahead of, several years prior, didn't venture into these territories at all. I would suggest that this is simply the most recent evidence that they're entirely untrustworthy. Again, see the sociopathy or psychopathy diagnosis at the beginning of this section. And so ultimately, I think it's important that, especially as people in positions of power in some of the more mainstream, more visible psychedelic institutions make statements about paranoiacs and our willingness to trust people for what they tell us, I think it's important for us to actually look at the histories and determine for ourselves whether or not we're engaging with trustworthy actors. Inaplexis is a really interesting firm that I don't know as much about as I would like to. Now, they recently showed that it was around Biogen. Biogen is another company. They made a prediction that Biogen's new Alzheimer drug was going to fail. All of, as I understand, like Berkshire Hathaway and a bunch of other large VC funds were betting on the success of that based on all the data that they had. However, Inaplexis was ultimately able to leverage their predictive AI blockchain approach to bet against all odds, ostensibly to the sum of large financial windfalls, particularly if we consider the way that markets work on speculation and ability to sort of place those bets on what will or won't happen in the future. Now, Inaplexis is again associated with Atai. I'm not 100% clear on the way that this technology could be leveraged within the psychedelic space. Something that I would throw out there, though, is that it epitomizes Zuboff's two texts approach to sort of the ledger of surveillance capitalism. So basically, when we consider the way that the internet functions, right, there's this public sphere of our interaction on, say, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, right? We get to see everything that happens, all of the public posts, everything that is designed for us to share with each other because it facilitates our social engagement with each other, or that's what we're told. However, there's this whole other text that's read-only for those who have access to it. So again, we see the stratification of classes, this time particularly in the information technology sphere, right? Where your metadata, all of the back end of tracking your interactions with newsfeed, your newsfeed, the way that these apps track your interactions as well as those of your friends and other folks in real time and attempt to serve you content literally as you're surfing through it. None of us get to see any of that. And so ultimately, Inaplexis stands at the margin or at the intersection of those two texts. There's also this firm, M2 Bio, which is a division of the Wuhan General Group over in China. One of the things I found particularly concerning when they popped up is this statement: just like it took time for the regulators to get behind marijuana, we believe the same will happen with magic mushrooms in due course. We want to be far ahead of the curve and become pioneers in the market, collaborating with legislative bodies to help find better and healthier solutions. As of, I think it was yesterday, they had just announced that they'll be exploring additional indications for psilocybin with the goal of bringing new therapies to market in the years to come, and that they had actually purchased what was it called? BioDelta Nutraceuticals, where they got 1.3 million square feet of cultivation space, a whole bunch. So basically, this was their press release, right? And it mentions medicinal marijuana and mushrooms. Nowhere in the press release do mushrooms come up, or psilocybin, I believe. However, if you see the sort of assets that they're going for, you can see that we're looking at industrial GMP quality production of psychoactives. Elucis Public Benefit Corporation, I mentioned them briefly in the context of LSD research. These slides are from an EPBC presentation that dealt with their proposed project at the Isle of Man. You can see here, as I've talked about elsewhere, that they are looking for an asymmetric return profile with they're calling the power law potential, so essentially exponential returns on investment. They're specifically highlighting first mover advantage. If you're unfamiliar, first mover advantage pretty much means you get on the terrain before anyone else. You can dictate the terms of engagement from then and there. You have opportunity costs. You have things like, nobody, if you think about Airbnb, Uber, Facebook, Amazon, the costs of dealing with another app because you have so many people involved in using those systems, the hurdles to get over in order to get engagement in those arenas are rather significant. And so you have the engagement with Compass, but then there's also this really interesting talk that Shlomi apparently gave back in 2009. Shlomi Raz is the head of EPBC. I haven't been able to find the content of the talk itself, but in the bio for the talk, it states that Shlomi helped pioneer the use of derivatives, both as weapons of mass financial destruction, and then he says for the betterment of humanity, which is rather questionable considering he was a Goldman exec and actually got hauled in by the SEC to answer for, some of his actions allegedly. There's a bit of information out there on him. Some of it's harder to find. I've only gone so deep. I would suggest other folks can too. To sort of wrap things up, we see the US military angling for psychedelic engagement. There was this article on microdosing for improving performance enhancement in intelligence analysis, where the author essentially asserted that warfare is inherently asymmetric, therefore it's very important that the military use every tool at their disposal to dig into it. So obviously, if we look at the histories of MK Ultra, there were regulatory hearings in '62 where FDA basically said to the military, look, and CIA, we're retracting all of our approval for above ground sanctioned research. However, we're going to let you guys do what you're doing. Not because we can't get the appropriate security clearances to oversee what you're doing, but rather out of bureaucratic deference and respect for you as an agency. Similarly, if we look at the military, I would suggest, in the past, MAPS has attempted to engage with active duty service members. One of the most clear-cut areas that calls for that seems to be around drone pilots, particularly based on the stressors and PTSD they're experiencing and the way that, most of them, many of them are living in US society, are living, off base and essentially commute to base. So you wind up with these weird sort of half of the day in a combat zone, half of the day in regular civilian life, which appears to be producing unique stressors. So with that all being said, corporadelics, anyone? I would suggest that I think there's pretty strong need to push back a lot against a lot of these narratives, approaches, actors, and that, ideally, to the extent that we have critiques and concerns, it's important to discuss them, not necessarily because we have clear-cut answers about how to get away from them or how to resolve them or how to unfuck ourselves from the absolute catastrophe of global industrial capitalism, but because if we don't talk about them, if we don't make the mess, if we can't figure out how we extricate ourselves, or at least start to try to highlight ways of extricating ourselves based on, any shared values we may have, based on potential strategic or tactical opportunities we see, I don't know how else we could possibly get out of the position we're in. And ultimately, I think at the end of the day, rather than seeing medicalized, mainstream, monolithic approaches or corporadelic ethoses, really, for me, it's always got to be psychedelics for the people. Thank you.